Okay, today we're looking at the quadratic equation. So this is just another method used for solving quadratics. And it can be used instead of completing the square. It can even be used instead of factoring. It'll work on all equations. Of course, the fastest way is to always factor it if possible. And then depending on what kind of equation it is, sometimes completing the square is easier and sometimes completing the quadratic equation will be easier. But the quadratic equation will actually work on any quadratic that you need to factor. But in order to use it, you have to have it in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You have to have it in descending order. You have to have everything on one side with 0 on the other. And it has to be in descending order of x squared, x, and then just your whole number there. And so if it's in that descending order, then the quadratic equation is that x is equal to a negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So you've probably seen this before, and there's actually songs made to help you memorize it. And so it is an important thing to memorize because you'll be using it a lot up in college algebra. And so again, it's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And if you notice, whoops, I was going to reach over here from completing the square. Where were we? That you see our answers when we worked through these ended up in something plus or minus the square root of something over some number. These just happen to be over 1. So completing the square and the quadratic equation will actually give you the same answer. So let's look at this first one. So you first check, is it equal to 0? So this is, and it's in descending order, x squared, x number. And so if that's the case, the number in front of the x squared is your a. This one doesn't have a number, so if it doesn't have one, it's an a. The one next to the x is your b, and then positive 5 is your c, including the sign. So be sure that you include those signs. So a is 1, b is negative 8, and c is positive 5. So we're going to plug it in the equation. So x is equal to a negative b, but a negative of a negative makes that a positive 8. So minus a negative makes that a positive, plus or minus the square root of negative 8 squared minus 4. A is 1, c is 5. So I just plugged in negative 8 for b, 1 for a, and 5 for c. And then it's all over 2a, or 2 times 1. And so now the hard part of this is simplifying this square root. I wish I wouldn't have written these over here, because really what we're going to do is we're going to go off and simplify this square root. So we're looking at just this square root. And so the square root of, don't worry about the square root. Negative 8 squared is 64. The biggest mistake people make on these is their sign. So then I want you to look at these 3 things, because we're going to multiply all these, and think of your sign rules. If you only have one negative, a negative times 2 positives always stays negative. If you have 2 negatives, it becomes a positive. 3 negatives is a negative, and so on. So you want to look at your signs and think, okay, I only have one negative, so it's going to stay a minus. And then I can say 4 times 5 is 20. And let's go ahead and continue to simplify that. So 64 minus 20 would be 44. So now I've got the square root of 44. And then we also want to simplify that as we go. So the square root of 44 would be the square root of 4 times the square root of 11, or 2 square roots of 11. So do you see we're learning what we used back in chapter 10. And then we're going to plug that back into the equation. So we had x equals 8 plus or minus. Do you see this whole thing became that 2 square roots of 11 over 2. Whoops, let me spread that up. Sorry. So take the square root off to the side, simplify it, and then bring it back in, and then it's much easier to look at. And then remember, this is from the last section too, that you look at this triangle here, and if anything can simplify within that triangle, then you want to. So all of those could be divided by 2. So your final answer is x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 11. And that's your answer. Again, you could find that same answer by completing the square in the previous video, which means move the 5 over, then take half and square it. You get the same answer either way. Okay, let's try this next one. Let me pull the formula back in frame here. So this is going to be my A, this is going to be my B, and this is going to be my C. So I have a negative B, so x would equal a negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times A is 2 times C is negative 1. Remember, you got to include the sign all over 2 times 2 because A is 2. Again, we're going to take just this little square root and work with this. So the square root would be 3 squared is 9. And now here's where I'm talking about your negatives. Do you see you have 2 negatives? So just don't mess up your signs. 2 negatives are going to make that a positive. And then 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 1 is 8. So I end up with the square root of 9 plus 8, or the square root of 17. You can't simplify 17 at all, so we're going to just plug it back into the formula now. So x would equal a negative 3, plus or minus the square root of 17 over 4. We look at our triangle, but this doesn't have a number. Let me do this in blue. So that's like a 1 there. You can write it or you don't have to, but there's nothing that will go into 3, 4, and 1, so you leave it just like that. This last one, before we can plug it in the formula, we have to make sure that it equals 0 and that everything is in descending order, and this one is not. So the first thing I have to do is move my 1 over and make this a 9x squared plus a 6x minus a 1 equals a 0. And now we can plug it in where this is my A, this is my B, and this is my C. So we're using the formula. So x is going to equal negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 9 times negative 1 all over 2 times 9. Again, we're going to worry about what's inside the square root here. So 6 squared is 36. We have 2 negatives. 2 negatives make a positive. And then 4 times 9 is 36. So remember, just be careful of your signs. If this was a negative also, then 3 negatives would make a negative. But we have 2 negatives, so it makes a positive. 36 plus 36 is 72. The square root of 72 breaks up to be the square root of 36 times the square root of 2. You might could have figured that out there, giving you 6 square roots of 2. So we're going to plug it back in the formula. So x equals a negative 6 plus or minus 6 square roots of 2 over, don't forget the bottom, 2 times 9 is 18. Then we look at our triangle here. Because they all have a 6 in common, we can divide them all by 6. And our final answer is going to be x equals a negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 2 over 3. And that's your final answer. So quadratic equation, you're just plugging it in, the quadratic formula, but before you do that, make sure everything's on one side, zero's on the other. And then also be careful of your signs inside the square root. That's where most mistakes come from. Okay, you're ready to try your practice problems for 11.3.